The first sign wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a crater in the middle of a city or a body falling from the sky. It was silence, deep, suffocating silence, inside places that were never quiet. Vought command rooms froze mid-sentence. Subs felt their powers stutter, not fail, just hesitate, like reality itself was holding its breath. In New York, Homelander stopped smiling on camera for the first time in years. His heart rate spiked without a threat in sight. He couldn't explain it. No enemy, no warning, just the unmistakable feeling that something had returned and it wasn't interested in being noticed. Somewhere between seconds, entire systems crashed. Satellites blinked out. Classified facilities lost power and never came back online. No one claimed responsibility. No one issued a threat. And that was the worst part. Because those who remembered, the few who survived the first encounter, understood the truth too late. This wasn't an arrival. It was a continuation. And this time, the universe didn't feel worth correcting. So what happens when a god comes back? Not to test, but to finish. You're watching the moment everything quietly goes wrong. This story doesn't resolve, it escalates. Subscribe once and stay with the arc, because what Beerus sets in motion here won't end in this part or this universe. No one saw Beerus arrive. There was no tear in the sky, no surge of energy, no warning signs that could be captured and replayed later. One moment the world of the boys' universe was moving forward on momentum and denial, and the next it felt subtly misaligned, like a structure whose foundation had shifted by a fraction of an inch. The air itself seemed heavier in places where power congregated, as if reality had identified points of weakness and leaned into them. At a Vought-controlled facility outside Manhattan, alarms began to misfire. Not blaring, not urgent, just wrong. Systems that had passed inspection hours earlier started reporting conflicting data. Temperature fluctuations without cause. Power drains with no source. Engineers blamed calibration errors, then human error, then quietly stopped speaking altogether as readouts contradicted each other in real time. None of them noticed the figure standing on the roof. Beerus looked exactly as he always had. Calm, upright, unimpressed. He didn't scan the horizon or flex his power. He simply stood there, arms loosely folded, tail flicking once as if acknowledging a faint irritation. The universe around him responded without instruction, minute adjustments rippling outward like a held breath finally released. Somewhere miles away, a high-ranking supe felt their knees weaken for half a second. Another dropped a glass without understanding why their hand had shaken. Across the city, several enhanced individuals experienced the same sensation. Not pain, not fear, but the sudden awareness that something had changed the rules without asking permission. Homelander felt it most sharply. He was mid-interview, smiling on cue, controlling every muscle in his face the way Vought had trained him to. Then the feeling hit, not a threat, not a challenge, but a memory. Fragmented and incomplete, like a dream you only remember the emotions from. His smile faltered for a single frame before he corrected it, but the damage was done. His heartbeat accelerated, his eyes unfocused for half a second longer than they should have. He didn't know why he felt afraid. After the cameras cut, Homelander retreated to a private corridor and stood alone, fists clenched, listening to his own breathing. His powers were fine, perfect, even. He could hear the building's electrical hum, the distant footsteps of staff, the blood rushing through his own veins. Nothing was wrong, and yet everything felt off. He remembered standing somewhere else once, remembered being ignored. The memory stopped there, leaving only unease. Vought executives convened within the hour. Officially, it was a routine systems review. Unofficially, it was panic wrapped in corporate language. Data analysts projected graphs that didn't stabilize. Risk assessment teams couldn't agree on what they were assessing. One senior executive referenced the previous anomaly in a hushed tone, then quickly rephrased it as the earlier incident, as if avoiding the word would make the subject manageable. They told themselves the first encounter had been survivable. Beerus hadn't destroyed the world then. He had left. That meant something, didn't it? It implied restraint, or curiosity, or rules. Vought liked rules. Rules could be learned, quantified, exploited. They were wrong. Beerus moved from the rooftop without urgency, stepping forward and simply no longer being there. He reappeared inside the facility's upper levels, not breaking walls or doors, just occupying space where none had been allocated for him. Scientists froze mid-motion. A security guard reached for his weapon and stopped halfway, his body refusing to complete the action. Beerus didn't look at them. He walked through corridors with quiet disinterest, every step subtly rewriting probabilities. Systems shut down as he passed, not violently but conclusively. Files corrupted. Backups failed. Redundancies vanished as if they had never existed. Entire research divisions lost years of work in seconds, erased not by intent but by proximity. One scientist found the courage to speak. What are you doing here?" Beerus paused, not because the question mattered but because it occupied the space. He turned his head slightly, eyes settling on the man with an expression that suggested mild disappointment, like a sound interrupting a thought. The scientist felt his throat close. He never finished the sentence he had planned next. Beerus didn't answer. When he moved again, the man ceased to exist, not violently, not explosively. One moment there, the next moment not. The absence was so complete it took several seconds for anyone nearby to realize something had happened at all. A gap in space where reality had been edited. Elsewhere, the boys felt the shift without understanding it. Butcher paused mid-argument, a scowl frozen on his face as a familiar instinct flared. This wasn't a fight he could pick. Huey felt cold despite the room's temperature, an inexplicable sense of being watched by something that wasn't interested in him. Checked his phone and frowned at the sudden lack of signal, then at the look on Butcher's face. "This feels bad," Huey said quietly. Butcher didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was low, controlled. "Yeah, this is the kind of bad you don't fix." Beerus continued his walk, eventually stepping out into open air again, now standing above the city as if it were a schematic laid out beneath him. He didn't destroy anything else. He didn't need to. His presence alone had already altered trajectories. Sups across the city felt their confidence erode for reasons they couldn't articulate. Vaught's internal command structure fractured as departments acted on incomplete information, each decision compounding the last mistake. Homelander finally took to the sky, hovering high above the skyline, scanning desperately for a threat he couldn't define. His eyes burned red for a moment, then dimmed. He didn't attack. He didn't shout. He waited, heart pounding, for something to acknowledge him. Beerus never looked up. After a long moment, Beerus turned away from the city and vanished once more, leaving behind a world scrambling to understand what had just happened. No announcement, no explanation, just the creeping certainty that this wasn't over. Because Beerus hadn't come back to judge. He had come back to review. And somewhere deep inside Vaught's collapsing systems, a final protocol activated, one that assumed escalation was still possible. The word survivable appeared in 3 separate reports before noon, each written by a different department, each meant to reassure someone else. Vought liked that word. It suggested precedent. It implied learning. Most importantly, it implied that whatever had happened before could be endured again with the right adjustments. None of the reports mentioned the missing floors. Not collapsed, not destroyed, missing. Entire sections of a Manhattan facility that no longer registered on structural scans, as if the building had been edited rather than damaged. Engineers argued over sensor faults until they physically reached the edges of absence and ran out of things to measure. Beerus hadn't returned to make a point. He had returned to see what remained. Vaught's emergency council convened in a sealed chamber, far below the tower's upper levels. The screens lining the room showed fragmented data feeds, outages spreading like ink through infrastructure maps, satellite gaps that refused to fill, and a growing list of assets marked unresponsive rather than lost. Language mattered when panic needed to be delayed. "This is still within acceptable variance," a senior analyst said, voice tight. "No direct engagement, no city-level destruction." Homelander stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, jaw set. He hadn't been asked to attend. That, more than anything else, told him how bad this was. "You're missing the point," he said flatly. The room went still. "The last time," Homelander continued, choosing his words carefully, "he left because he was bored." Several executives avoided eye contact. "And now?" someone asked. Homelander's gaze drifted to a flickering screen showing a blank square where a facility should have been. Now he's checking his work. That ended the meeting's pretense. Vought activated Protocol Atlas, a contingency designed for existential threats that couldn't be framed publicly. Assets were repositioned. Soup teams were placed on standby without explanation. Legal began preemptively sealing records tied to the first encounter, quietly classifying entire years of data retroactively. They assumed escalation meant confrontation. They assumed wrong. Beerus didn't move quickly. He didn't need to. His presence traveled ahead of him, an atmospheric pressure that bent decisions before he arrived. In Chicago, a Black Ops lab shut down mid-experiment as containment fields failed without triggering alarms. In Nevada, a weapons test never completed its countdown, the final digit refusing to appear. Operators stared at frozen screens until command ordered evacuation. No explosion followed. Just absence. Homelander chased the feeling across state lines, flying faster than he ever had without breaking the sound barrier, terrified of being seen as frantic. He scanned cities, bases, offshore platforms, anything that mattered. Every time he arrived, the sensation faded, like he was always a step behind. He remembered that feeling. The memory sharpened this time. Standing in a ruined place, power useless, being looked through, not at. The realization made his stomach turn. The boys felt the escalation through different channels. Huey watched emergency briefings leak in real time, the phrasing growing more careful with every update. Butcher listened to contacts go quiet one by one, each conversation ending with some version of "we don't want to be involved." "This isn't about leverage anymore," MM said. "This is about not being noticed." "That's worse," Butcher replied. "Means we can't poke it." Beerus appeared again without announcement, this time in a Vought logistics hub outside Denver. He didn't walk the corridors. He stood in the center of a massive warehouse filled with equipment meant to move other equipment, forklifts, drones, automated rails, all frozen mid-operation. He looked around once. Then he reached out and tapped the air. The gesture was small, almost dismissive. Every piece of technology in the building failed simultaneously. Not shorted, not overloaded, failed. Circuits went inert, batteries drained to zero, mechanical backups locked as if welded in place. The building remained standing, pristine and useless. Beerus turned and vanished. The message arrived at Vought headquarters minutes later. A single-line report from a field supervisor, written by shaking hands. All systems dead, no damage, nothing recoverable. Executives stared at the line in silence. This wasn't destruction. It was removal. Homelander finally found him. High above the Rockies, Beerus hovered alone, gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The sky around him felt strained, like it was accommodating something heavier than it was meant to hold. Homelander slowed as he approached, every instinct screaming caution. He stopped 10 meters away. Beerus didn't turn. "You came back," Homelander said, voice steady by force of will alone. Beerus remained silent. Homelander swallowed. "If this is about balance, we can fix." Beerus glanced at him then, just a glance. No anger, no interest. Homelander felt his legs lock. Beerus looked away again. The dismissal was complete. Homelander backed off without realizing he was doing it, retreating into the sky, heart racing, pride in tatters. He told no one about the encounter. He couldn't explain it without sounding weak. Back on the ground, Vought's final assumption collapsed. Beerus wasn't escalating. He was concluding. Facilities began shutting down preemptively, executives choosing survival over usefulness. Governments issued quiet advisories to avoid certain airspaces without explanation. Subs went to ground, sensing that visibility itself had become a liability. Beerus watched it all from nowhere in particular, tail flicking once as probabilities realigned around him. The universe was making choices. Some were acceptable, others were not. He turned his attention next to something older, something deeper, a foundation Vought hadn't even known it relied on. And when that attention shifted, the world felt it. Vought's internal language changed first. Words like countermeasure and neutralization vanished from briefings, replaced by softer phrases meant to preserve morale. Delay, obscuration, minimize exposure. The shift was subtle, but everyone noticed. When an organization built on control stops talking about control, something fundamental has already broken. Protocol Atlas was officially reclassified as an information integrity framework. Unofficially, it became a way to decide which truths could be buried fast enough to matter. Entire departments were reassigned overnight, not to stop Beerus, but to ensure no one could accurately track where he had been. If patterns couldn't be proven, panic could still be framed as coincidence. That illusion lasted less than 12 hours. The first leak didn't come from a whistleblower or a hacked server. It came from an automated insurance audit. A regional underwriter flagged a cluster of properties across 3 states that no longer qualified for coverage, not because they were damaged, but because their risk profiles had become undefined. The system couldn't calculate exposure where variables no longer obeyed assumptions. Vought's legal division scrambled to intercept the notice. They failed. By the time executives convened again, mainstream news outlets were already speculating about localized reality failures, a phrase that sounded ridiculous enough to be dismissed. That was the plan. Ridicule first, clarification later, control restored. Homelander watched the coverage alone, standing in a soundproof room designed for image calibration. The footage showed empty buildings, intact roads, and confused officials repeating the same line. No threat to public safety. He could hear the lie in their voices. He could also feel the absence growing. Every instinct told him to do something visible, to assert presence, to remind the world who he was. Instead, he found himself hesitating, haunted by the memory of being looked past. He hadn't told Vought about the encounter in the Rockies, but they could see it in him anyway. The forced smiles, the unnecessary patrols, the way he lingered in the sky, searching for something he didn't want to find. Beerus did not return to a city. He appeared inside a place that wasn't meant to be a place at all. Deep beneath a decommissioned research campus in Europe, Vought had maintained a legacy archive, an aggregation of early compound V data, behavioral projections, and predictive models built to answer one question: what happens when power compounds faster than control? The archive had been sealed after the first encounter, its existence denied even within the company. Beerus stood at its center, surrounded by glass columns filled with frozen data streams. He didn't touch them. He didn't need to. He looked. The systems reacted as if scanned by something they couldn't register. Predictive loops stuttered. Probability matrices collapsed into static. Years of simulations, each designed to forecast escalation, failed simultaneously, their outputs converging on a single unreadable result. Beerus tilted his head. This was the foundation he'd felt. Not a weapon, not a plan, an assumption. That assumption ceased to function. Above ground, the archive's handlers noticed the failure not through alarms but through success. Every active simulation returned null. No error codes, no warnings, just the absence of outcome. For the first time, Vought's future-facing models couldn't imagine a next step. Beerus vanished again. The effects rippled outward. Across the globe, predictive systems tied to Vought, financial algorithms, threat assessments, SOOP deployment forecasts, began producing conservative outputs. Not because danger had lessened, but because uncertainty had spiked beyond tolerance thresholds. Decisions slowed, launches delayed, authority hesitated. Governments felt it immediately. Emergency councils convened without agendas. Military planners found their escalation ladders abruptly shortened, options disappearing as assumptions failed. You can't prepare for a response that doesn't repeat itself. The boys noticed the change on the ground, not through violence but through absence. SUPs stopped posturing, patrols thinned. The usual background noise of intimidation dropped to a low hum. "They're scared," Huey said, watching a live stream of a half-empty rally. "But they don't know why," MM added. Butcher leaned back, jaw tight. "Means something, eating the foundations." Vought attempted containment anyway. Not physical, narrative. A controlled disclosure was drafted, framing the anomalies as a classified joint exercise involving experimental tech. Friendly pundits were briefed. Experts were booked. The story rolled out with precision. Then Beerus appeared on live television. Not intentionally. He hovered in the background of a regional broadcast, barely noticeable at first, a slender silhouette suspended far above a city skyline. The anchor continued speaking unaware. Viewers noticed before producers did. Social media clipped the moment, zoomed in, enhanced it. The figure didn't move, didn't react, didn't acknowledge the attention. Beerus remained there for exactly 8 seconds. Then the feed cut, not from interference but from a sudden loss of signal originating inside the studio. Cameras died, backup generators failed. The broadcast never resumed. The clip went viral anyway. Homelander saw it minutes later. His breath caught. He recognized the posture, the indifference, the way the world seemed smaller around that presence. He realized then what Vought still hadn't accepted. Beerus wasn't dismantling assets. He was invalidating relevance. If something couldn't function without being important, it didn't survive. Vought's final contingency involved retreat. Facilities went dark voluntarily. Programs were paused indefinitely. Executives began moving families without explanation. The corporation that once shaped the world now tried to make itself small. It didn't matter. Beerus wasn't looking for resistance anymore. He was looking for what remained when resistance stopped. And his attention, once again, began to drift. This time towards something that couldn't hide. Silence became the first universal language. It didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through policy memos, revised procedures, and half-finished sentences during press briefings. Governments stopped announcing timelines. Corporations stopped forecasting growth. Even the media learned to soften its tone, replacing certainty with conditional phrasing that felt almost apologetic. The world hadn't been ordered to be quiet. It had simply learned that noise no longer guaranteed attention. In cities where SUPs once dominated skylines, patrols were reduced to symbolic flyovers. Not because threats were gone, but because presence no longer equaled control. The unspoken fear was simple. What if being seen made things worse? What if visibility invited notice from something that didn't need an invitation? Vought restructured again, this time without announcing it even internally. Entire chains of command were dissolved into temporary task groups with no authority to act independently. Decision-making slowed to a crawl, filtered through layers of legal caution and existential dread. They called it prudence. Homelander felt it as abandonment. The cameras still followed him, but they no longer shaped the narrative. Every appearance felt staged in a way that stripped him of spontaneity. His words were pre-approved, his locations selected for minimal unpredictability. Vought didn't trust the world with him anymore. Worse, they didn't trust him with the world. He hovered above a quiet coastal city one afternoon, the ocean beneath him calm in a way that felt mocking. A crowd had gathered out of habit more than excitement. Their applause was polite, their cheers delayed. Some didn't look up at all. He landed anyway. The speech was meant to reassure. He delivered it flawlessly, every word practiced, every gesture calibrated. The crowd listened. They even clapped. But they didn't react. No awe, no fear, no sense of relief. For the first time, Homelander realized he wasn't the center of their attention anymore. He was a reminder of something that used to matter, a symbol from before the silence. He ended the appearance early. Far from the cameras, the boys watched the shift with cautious disbelief. Butcher expected chaos, not restraint. He'd built his entire worldview around escalation. Push hard enough and the system cracks. Instead, the system was withdrawing, like an animal curling in on itself. "This isn't them losing," he muttered. "This is them hiding." Huey shook his head. "No, this is them adapting. They're scared of being noticed." MM frowned. "By what?" No one answered. Beerus hadn't been seen for days. That absence weighed heavier than any destruction. Markets dipped on rumors alone. Intelligence agencies flagged unexplained pauses in satellite data, moments where sensors simply stopped reporting, not due to interference, but due to undefined errors. Reality itself seemed reluctant to commit. Then Beerus appeared again, this time in a place defined by secrecy. Not a lab, not a base, a meeting. Deep within a secured underground chamber, representatives from multiple governments had convened under a classified emergency accord. No cameras, no digital devices, everything analog. The room was built to resist surveillance, designed under the assumption that if you could block observation, you could preserve autonomy. Beerus materialized at the far end of the table, seated before anyone noticed he wasn't supposed to be there. No alarm sounded. No guards moved. The air felt heavier, not oppressive, but final. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as awareness rippled outward, each person realizing the same impossible truth at the same time. Beerus looked at no one in particular. He tapped one finger lightly against the table. The reinforced composite cracked. Not shattered, not exploded, just fractured enough to reveal how thin it really was. The sound echoed through the chamber, sharper than any shout. Beerus stood. No one spoke. He didn't threaten, didn't gesture, didn't explain. He simply walked toward the exit, passing representatives who had spent their lives believing proximity to power equaled influence. As he passed, screens along the walls flickered to life on their own, displaying live feeds from around the world. Not disasters, not attacks, just normalcy. Cities, roads, crowds paused in moments of indecision. Beerus stopped at the doorway. "This," he said calmly, his voice carrying without effort, "is what remains when relevance fails." Then he was gone. The chamber collapsed seconds later, not structurally but functionally. Systems shut down, locks disengaged, communications failed. The meeting ended without adjournment, its purpose rendered meaningless. The message spread faster than facts ever could. The world learned to whisper. News outlets adopted neutral palettes and softer music. Headlines lost their edge. Even outrage became muted, as if anger itself feared escalation. People adjusted subconsciously, lowering their voices in public spaces, avoiding eye contact with the sky. Subs felt it most. Their power still worked, their strength remained, but reactions dulled. Fear was no longer automatic. Admiration no longer guaranteed. Without those feedback loops, dominance felt hollow. Homelander retreated into isolation. He replayed the memory of Beerus's silence again and again, trying to extract meaning from indifference. He couldn't. There was no pattern, no weakness, just a certainty that whatever mattered to him didn't matter there. Vought attempted one final maneuver: visibility reduction. They pulled major subs from public roles, reframing it as a strategic repositioning. The narrative was careful, the tone respectful, the implication clear. Restraint was strength. But behind closed doors, executives argued over an unspoken truth. If Beerus returned again, there would be no misinterpretation. The boys understood that too. "This isn't about stopping him," Huey said quietly. "It's about surviving whatever he decides to finish." Butcher clenched his fists, and if he decides there's nothing worth finishing. No one answered. Far above the planet, unseen by any instrument designed to measure importance, Beerus hovered in stillness. His eyes traced the faint outlines of a world that had learned to lower its voice. It wasn't enough. Something still clung to significance. Something still believed it mattered. Beerus began to descend. The first rule everyone learned was not written down. It emerged quietly, reinforced by repetition rather than instruction. No one said it aloud, because saying it felt like tempting something that no longer needed reasons. Do not escalate. What began as caution hardened into ritual. Military drills were revised to remove contingency branches that assumed retaliation. Nuclear protocols were rewritten to emphasize delay over response. Even language shifted. Terms like deterrence and countermeasure were replaced with softer, less assertive phrases that implied patience rather than power. The world wasn't disarming. It was hesitating. Governments still possessed weapons capable of ending civilizations, but the confidence to use them had eroded. Deterrence only worked when both sides cared about loss. Beerus had demonstrated something far worse than invulnerability. He had demonstrated disinterest. Vought felt the pressure first. Stock prices stabilized not because of recovery, but because volatility itself had become suspicious. Investors no longer rewarded ambition. Growth was seen as provocation, expansion as noise. The boardroom language shifted toward maintenance of relevance, a phrase that meant nothing and terrified everyone. They needed a show of control. Not strength, control. Vaught's solution was ritualized deterrence, predictable, restrained, and intentionally unimpressive. Sups were assigned to repetitive, low-impact appearances. No surprises, no improvisation. Every move documented, every action framed as stability rather than dominance. Homelander hated it. His flight paths were mapped days in advance. His speeches edited down to neutrality. Even his uniform was subtly redesigned, colors dulled, insignia minimized. He was still the strongest thing in the sky, but nothing about him was allowed to feel absolute. He confronted his handlers privately, voice low, eyes sharp. "You're making me smaller," he said. They didn't deny it. They spoke carefully, using words like context and environment. They explained that visibility carried risk, that unpredictability invited scrutiny. They never said Beerus's name, but it hung between them like a third presence. Homelander didn't shout. That frightened them more. Across the city, the boys watched the transformation with uneasy fascination. This wasn't the collapse they'd imagined. No riots, no coups, just a slow erosion of certainty. "He's still dangerous," MM said, watching a muted broadcast of Homelander's latest appearance. "But he doesn't know how to exist like this." Butcher snorted. "That's the point. Take away the mirror, the monster starves." Yet even Butcher couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't victory. It was adaptation under threat, and adaptations could fail catastrophically. The ritual spread beyond institutions. Cities adopted curfews without declaring emergencies. Public events became smaller, quieter. People avoided large crowds instinctively, not out of fear of attack, but out of fear of being noticed. The sky itself felt different, empty not because no one flew, but because no one wanted to. Then the rituals began to fracture. It started in a desert test range, chosen precisely because nothing important lived there. A multinational task force had authorized a controlled demonstration. No weapons, no signals, just a minor spatial anomaly generated by experimental tech. The goal wasn't to threaten. It was to signal readiness. The anomaly activated. For 3 seconds, reality bent just enough to register. Sensors spiked. Data streamed. The task force congratulated itself on restraint. Beerus arrived before the anomaly collapsed. Not violently, not dramatically. He simply appeared at the center of the distortion, standing where physics had briefly failed, examining it with mild curiosity. Personnel froze. No alarms triggered. The systems didn't recognize him as a threat profile. Beerus raised one finger and tapped the air. The anomaly vanished, not neutralized, not reversed, erased, as if it had never existed, along with every data record associated with it. Logs went blank, memories blurred. Even the scientists struggled to recall precise parameters moments later. Beerus looked around. This, he said calmly, was unnecessary. Then he left. The message was unmistakable. Ritual without meaning was still noise. The fallout was immediate and invisible. The task force disbanded without explanation. Funding vanished overnight. Governments issued vague statements about shifting priorities. The world absorbed the lesson without protest. Deterrence, once a strategy, became superstition. People believed that certain behaviors invited attention, that some actions were safer than others, despite lacking evidence. Entire industries reshaped themselves around avoidance rather than ambition. Subs felt it acutely. Their training emphasized restraint over dominance. Powers were capped in public settings. Even private demonstrations were discouraged. The fear wasn't punishment, it was review. Homelander felt himself slipping into irrelevance. He could still crush steel, still move faster than sound, but no one needed him to prove it. No crisis escalated far enough to justify his presence. When disasters occurred, they were handled quietly, surgically, without spectacle. He wasn't being challenged. He was being sidelined. One night, unable to tolerate the silence, Homelander broke protocol. He ascended above the city without clearance, stopping just short of the clouds. The wind tore at his cape as he hovered, waiting. Nothing happened. No applause, no panic, no summons. The city continued below him, indifferent. For the first time, Homelander felt small, not physically, but contextually. Like a weapon locked in a vault everyone had forgotten how to open. Far away, Beerus watched. Not with anger, not with judgment. With assessment. The world had learned to whisper, but it was still trying to be heard. Rituals had replaced conviction. Deterrence had become performance, stripped of belief. Beerus closed his eyes briefly. The universe was stabilizing in the wrong direction. And somewhere deep within its systems, something still believed it could be prepared. Beerus descended again. Not toward a weapon, not toward a city, but toward the idea that readiness itself might be enough. Preparation had once been a comfort. It was the idea that separated civilization from panic, the belief that if something went wrong, someone, somewhere, had already planned for it. Contingencies layered atop contingencies, redundancies designed to outlive catastrophe. The world had survived this long not because it was peaceful, but because it believed it could respond. Beerus had turned that belief into a liability. After the desert incident, preparation itself became suspect. Any movement that suggested readiness felt like provocation. Any system designed to respond too quickly risked being interpreted as ambition. And ambition, the world had learned, was loud. So governments adapted the only way they knew how. They slowed down. Emergency response times were quietly extended. Decision trees gained extra approval layers. Automated systems were downgraded to advisory roles, their authority stripped back to human discretion. The logic was simple and deeply flawed. Humans hesitated, machines did not, and hesitation felt safer. It cost lives almost immediately. A coastal city lost power after a routine storm overwhelmed infrastructure that would once have triggered an automated response. Instead, officials waited for confirmation, then authorization, then consensus. By the time generators came online, hospitals were already improvising triage in darkness. No one blamed Beerus publicly, but everyone felt his absence like pressure on the back of the neck. Vought experienced the cost more directly. Their internal preparedness division, once the most aggressive, most secretive branch of the company, had been reduced to a think tank with no authority. Every proposal was filtered through risk committees whose primary question was no longer, will this work? It was, will this be noticed? Engineers learned to design solutions that failed gracefully rather than succeeded loudly. Breakthroughs were buried, promising projects shelved indefinitely, not because they were dangerous, but because they were impressive. Impressiveness had become dangerous. Homelander watched all of this with growing resentment. He was still deployed, still visible, but only in controlled environments. Disaster relief appearances, carefully scripted rescues, nothing that required improvisation. Nothing that required him. The cost wasn't just relevance, it was identity. Homelander had been shaped by reaction. Fear had been his mirror, admiration his fuel. Now both were rationed, diluted by caution. Crowds no longer screamed when he landed. They watched, measured, uncertain whether cheering was appropriate. He confronted Ashley again, this time without theatrics. "You're scared," he said flatly. She didn't deny it. Everyone is. "Of me." Her hesitation lasted half a second too long. "Of what happens when things escalate," she corrected. "Of what escalation brings." Homelander smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You think I'm the escalation." Ashley swallowed. "You're a variable." The word cut deeper than any insult. Meanwhile, the boys felt the weight from the opposite side. This wasn't the chaos they'd expected. The system hadn't collapsed, it had calcified. Power structures remained intact but brittle. Fear had replaced momentum. "This is how it ends," Frenchie muttered one night, watching a news feed scroll through muted crises. Not with fire, with paperwork. Butcher wasn't listening. He was focused on a pattern only he seemed to see. "Everyone's waiting," he said. "Not for Beerus, for permission to stop pretending." Huey frowned. Pretending what? That they're in control. The cost of preparation wasn't just inefficiency, it was paralysis. Every institution was optimized to avoid attention, not to solve problems. The world was quieter, slower, and increasingly fragile. And then something broke. Not a weapon, not a city. A belief. A regional defense network, designed explicitly to not activate without layered confirmation, failed to respond to an unauthorized incursion. The intruder wasn't Beerus. It wasn't even a super. It was a rogue asset, exploiting the hesitation built into the system. By the time human authorization came through, the damage was irreversible. The incident didn't make headlines. It was buried under euphemisms and delayed reports, but within classified circles, the conclusion was unanimous. Preparedness had become performative. Systems existed not to function, but to signal restraint. And restraint, without capability, was indistinguishable from weakness. Beerus observed all of this without intervention. He had not returned to punish. He had returned to observe consequences, to see what a universe did when it mistook silence for safety. The answer disappointed him. This universe didn't learn humility. It learned avoidance. Beerus stood at the edge of a space station, unnoticed by its occupants, watching Earth rotate below. He felt the subtle distortions, the way reality bent around decisions not made, actions delayed, responsibilities deferred. "This isn't balance," he murmured. It wasn't a judgment, it was an assessment. Preparation had become theater. Deterrence had become ritual. Power structures had learned the wrong lesson. Not that force invited consequence, but that inaction invited survival. Beerus raised his hand, not to destroy but to test. Somewhere on Earth, a system designed to never fail activated for the first time in months. Not a weapon, a warning protocol, old, forgotten, built before fear had reshaped priorities. It triggered automatically. Beerus felt it immediately. He smiled faintly, not because it threatened him, but because it meant something in this universe still remembered how to act. The cost of being prepared had been high. The cost of forgetting how would be higher. Beerus turned his gaze back toward Earth, curiosity rekindling, not amused, not angry, but alert. The universe had made its choice. Now he would see if it could live with it. The warning protocol was never meant to be seen. It was older than the current administration, older than most of the people now responsible for maintaining it. Built in an era when escalation was feared less than inaction, it existed to answer one question only. Has something crossed a threshold no one is authorized to acknowledge? When it activated, it didn't sound alarms. It didn't notify the public. It rerouted data streams, isolated communication nodes, and initiated silent cross-checks designed to confirm the unconfirmable. For the first time since Beerus' return, something in the system acted without asking permission. The response was immediate and panicked. Within minutes, senior officials across multiple governments received the same encrypted notice. Not an explanation, not a recommendation, just a status update that shouldn't have been possible anymore. Autonomous alert confirmed. Phones rang that hadn't rung in months. Emergency channels reopened under different names. Analysts who had spent weeks refining language to soften reality were suddenly forced to confront it directly. Something had changed. Vought felt it first at the executive level. Their internal sensors, those few not deliberately downgraded, registered a fluctuation they couldn't suppress. It wasn't destructive. It wasn't aggressive. It was present. Board members demanded answers that no one could provide. Legal teams scrambled to assess exposure. PR departments drafted statements they would never release. Because for the first time since Beerus' return, hiding felt more dangerous than reacting. Homelander was in the air when the protocol triggered. He didn't hear it, he didn't see it, but he felt it like static crawling under his skin. The sky didn't change color. The city below didn't erupt into chaos. Everything looked the same. That terrified him. This wasn't the dread he'd felt before, raw, instinctive fear without context. This was different, sharper, focused, like standing in a room where someone else had just realized you were there. He slowed mid-flight. For years, Homelander had believed power was defined by reaction. Fear meant relevance. Silence meant anticipation. But this silence was wrong. It wasn't waiting for him. It was evaluating. Back on the ground, the boys noticed the shift through absence. Surveillance feeds went dark without explanation. Police response patterns changed subtly, as if guided by a logic none of them could see. Huey stared at a live map, frowning. They're not freezing anymore. Leaned closer. They're coordinating. But without orders, Huey replied, that's new. Butcher said nothing. His jaw tightened as the implications settled in. Someone or something had reminded the world how to act without permission. Beerus watched the reaction with interest. He hadn't caused the protocol to activate. He hadn't needed to. Its existence alone was proof that this universe had once understood restraint differently, not as hesitation, but as discipline. Now that discipline was resurfacing. Not enough to threaten him, not even close, but enough to be noticed. For the first time since his return, Beerus adjusted his posture, a subtle shift, acknowledgement not of danger but of intent. "This is what you kept," he observed quietly, "and this is what you forgot." His presence sharpened, not expanding, not intensifying, simply becoming more defined. Reality responded the way it always did when something absolute clarified itself. Systems that had been coasting on ambiguity began to fail outright, not catastrophically, precisely. Functions designed to obscure responsibility shut down, layers built to delay decisions dissolved. The world wasn't breaking. It was being simplified. Vought lost 3 divisions in under an hour, not to destruction, but to exposure. Data that had been compartmentalized by fear suddenly reconnected. Internal contradictions surfaced. Cover stories unraveled under their own weight. No announcement was made. No explosion marked the moment. But everyone inside Vought understood the truth at the same time. They were no longer in control of the narrative. Homelander landed on a rooftop, breathing harder than he should have been. His reflection stared back at him from a darkened window, perfect, composed, powerful, and uncertain. He pressed his hand against the glass. "I'm still here," he muttered, as if saying it out loud might make it true. The city didn't respond. Crowds below moved with unfamiliar purpose, not panicked, not reverent, just focused. Emergency vehicles followed routes that made sense. News feeds stopped speculating and started reporting confirmed facts only. Fear hadn't vanished. It had been reorganized. Homelander realized then what he'd been feeling all along. This wasn't Beerus ignoring him. This was Beerus accounting for him and finding nothing worth isolating. The realization hollowed him out. For the first time, Homelander wasn't afraid of being destroyed. He was afraid of being included in the background. Beerus turned away from Earth briefly, sensing the larger structure of this universe settling into a new configuration. It wouldn't save itself. It wouldn't resist him. But it might endure longer than expected. That was interesting. He extended a finger and traced an invisible line through space. Not an attack, a marker, a reference point that only something on his level could perceive. This continues, he decided. Not aloud, not to anyone. The universe responded by adjusting around that decision. On Earth, systems stabilized into something leaner and more dangerous, not because they were stronger, but because they were no longer pretending to be harmless. Preparation had remembered itself. And true power had noticed. Not to intervene, but to stay. What followed wasn't chaos. That was the mistake everyone made at first, waiting for panic, for riots, for the sharp noise of collapse. Instead, the world entered a phase that felt unnervingly deliberate. Like debris settling after an unseen impact, structures adjusted themselves without ceremony. The autonomous protocol didn't spread. It didn't need to. Its activation was enough to remind systems of an older rule set, one written before layers of branding, before fear became a substitute for authority. Agencies stopped posturing. Militaries stopped signaling. Not because they were afraid of Beerus, but because they were afraid of being noticed by something that didn't mistake activity for relevance. The shape of the world changed. Vought survived, technically. The company still existed on paper. Its logo still glowed on skyscrapers and screens. But inside, the hierarchy warped. Departments that once drove decisions found themselves ignored. Committees dissolved into advisory roles. Executives stopped asking what they could do and started asking what they shouldn't. This wasn't reform, it was retreat. Internal communications grew shorter. Risk assessments replaced projections. Projects were framed not around success, but invisibility. The most dangerous phrase inside Vought became best-case scenario. No one wanted to define it anymore. Homelander felt the shift more acutely than anyone. He was still the strongest thing on the planet by every measurable standard that had once mattered, but the measurements had changed. He wasn't being challenged. He wasn't being replaced. He was being bypassed. Requests for his presence declined. Missions were reassigned to teams. Public appearances were shortened, scripted tighter, applause quieter. The cameras still loved him, but the people behind them had stopped improvising. Homelander confronted a handler mid-briefing, gripping the edge of a table hard enough to leave impressions. "Why am I not first call?" The handler didn't flinch. That alone was new. "We're minimizing escalation," she said carefully, "across the board." Homelander laughed, sharp and humorless. "I am escalation." She met his eyes. Exactly. The word followed him for days. Meanwhile, the boys watched the world grow unfamiliar in subtler ways. Black sites went dark, not destroyed, just abandoned. Surveillance didn't increase, it narrowed. Targets were chosen with precision rather than appetite. Described it best one night, staring at a city skyline that looked unchanged but felt wrong. "It's like the world lost weight," he said. "Not healthier, just less." Huey nodded, less pretending. Butcher wasn't comforted. He paced, restless, unable to find the angle. "This ain't a win, it's a pause. You don't tidy up before a victory. You do it before something decides what's worth keeping." Beerus observed the new configuration from a distance that wasn't spatial. He wasn't hovering. He wasn't watching screens or cities. He was sensing shape, the way influence flowed, the way decisions clustered. The universe had compressed. Where there had once been noise, there was signal. Where there had been ambition, there was caution. This wasn't balance restored. It was clarity imposed. And clarity had consequences. Entire categories of power lost relevance overnight. Political leverage softened. Media influence thinned. Military presence mattered less than alignment, not with Beerus, but with the idea that some actions attracted attention and others did not. Subs felt it too. Not as fear, but as hesitation in the crowds. Cheers came later, if at all. Children waved, but adults watched with calculation. Power still worked. Strength still mattered. But all had changed. Homelander tried to reclaim it the only way he knew how, through spectacle. A controlled crisis. A rescue pushed just far enough to remind people of what he was. It backfired. The operation succeeded. No casualties, no visible mistakes, but the reaction was muted, applause polite. Commentators measured their words. The question circulating online wasn't how he did it. It was whether it had been necessary. Homelander stood alone in a hallway afterward, listening to the distant echo of his own footsteps. For the first time, he felt small without being threatened. Beerus noticed that too. Not Homelander specifically, but the way symbols decayed when the structure around them changed. This universe had leaned heavily on icons, on singular figures that absorbed collective fear and admiration. Now those figures cast shorter shadows. "This is survivable," Beerus concluded. Not approval, not mercy. Just assessment. He turned his attention outward briefly, sensing the boundaries of this reality. It wasn't unique. It wasn't special. But it had adjusted more efficiently than most after a disruption of this magnitude. That made it acceptable, for now. On Earth, the adjustments continued, quietly, permanently. The world wasn't safer. It was narrower. And somewhere deep in that narrowing, a question took root, not spoken aloud, not even consciously formed. What happens when something that reshapes the world decides to stop watching? The answer hadn't arrived yet, but the shape of what remained was already preparing for it. Silence had become policy. Not the absence of sound, but the deliberate removal of noise from decision-making. Briefings shortened, press conferences canceled, statements reduced to facts without commentary. The world had learned that attention itself could be interpreted as intent, and intent invited review. But silence, like power, has a threshold. It answers back when leaned on too hard. The first sign came from a place no one had been watching anymore. A decommissioned oversight council that technically still existed, but had been rendered irrelevant by months of avoidance. Its members hadn't been activated, briefed, or consulted since Beerus' return. That was the point. They were designed to ask questions no one wanted to answer. They convened anyway. No broadcast, no leaks, just a meeting record quietly logged into an archival system that hadn't been scrubbed yet. The conclusion was simple and devastating. The universe had been reshaped by absence, not action, and absence could not be negotiated with. Vought felt the echo of that conclusion almost immediately. Their risk models, already stripped down, began contradicting each other. Scenarios built on non-intervention produced worse outcomes than limited exposure. Entire regions became unstable not because Beerus acted, but because everyone else refused to. Avoidance had stopped working. Inside Vought Tower, executives argued in closed rooms with the intensity of people who knew the rules had changed again, but didn't know how. One faction pushed for renewed visibility, controlled demonstrations of authority, proof that the system still functioned. Another insisted that any assertion of control risked drawing attention from something that had not yet decided whether this universe was finished. Neither side won, because something else happened. Homelander cracked. Not publicly, not violently, internally first. It started with a mistake, small, human, unforgivable. During a routine appearance, he missed a cue, half a second late to respond. The cameras caught it. The internet noticed. Analysts dissected the pause like it was a confession. He saw it everywhere afterward, in the way handlers spoke more carefully, in how crowds hesitated before cheering, in how children stared longer, searching for something they couldn't name. Homelander had always fed on certainty. His own reflected back at him. Now certainty had thinned, replaced by evaluation. He confronted a mirror one night and didn't recognize the silence staring back. When he finally lashed out, it wasn't against a city or a crowd. It was against irrelevance. He forced a confrontation, cornered a threat that didn't require his presence, escalated beyond necessity, made sure the world watched. The result was immediate and catastrophic. Not in casualties, in response. Authorities didn't praise him. They didn't condemn him either. They corrected him, quietly, procedurally. A statement framed the incident as overextension. New protocols were introduced to optimize deployment. Homelander wasn't punished. He was managed. The realization hollowed him out faster than fear ever had. The boys watched the fallout from a distance. Huey scrolled through feeds that looked normal on the surface, but carried a different undertone. "They're not scared of him anymore," he said softly. Shook his head. "They're not impressed." Butcher's expression darkened. "Worse, they think he's a liability." Silence answered back again, this time from Beerus. He hadn't moved. He hadn't acted. But the universe's internal friction reached a point where it registered as inefficiency, where avoidance created more disturbance than correction. That was when Beerus intervened. Not with destruction, with subtraction. A node vanished, not a city, not a person, a function, a systemic pressure point that had survived through inertia rather than purpose. Its removal caused no explosion, no shockwave. But its absence realigned everything around it. Supply chains rerouted. Jurisdictions overlapped differently. Power flowed along simpler paths. The universe exhaled. Those sensitive enough felt it immediately. Beerus' intervention wasn't judgment, it was maintenance. This was never about fear, he noted, it was about clutter. On Earth, the effects were profound and irreversible. Entire sectors collapsed overnight, not violently, but completely. Authority structures that relied on opacity dissolved. The mechanisms that had once protected Vought through complexity now worked against it. Executives disappeared, not assassinated, not arrested, just gone, resigned, relocated, erased from relevance. Vought's brand survived. Its control did not. Homelander stood alone in a briefing room that had been designed for deference. No handlers, no applause cues, just screens displaying updated deployment matrices where his name appeared less frequently than it used to. He understood then. This wasn't Beerus punishing him. This was Beerus confirming what the world had already decided. Homelander was not essential. The boys felt the shift as opportunity and threat intertwined. The system they'd fought for years was unraveling, not in flames, but in silence. And silence made enemies harder to find. Butcher clenched his fists. "This is what happens when gods tidy up," he growled. "No mess, no blame." Beerus turned his attention outward once more, sensing the broader pattern. This universe had crossed another threshold, not into collapse, but into something leaner and colder. It could function like this. It could even thrive. But it would never be the same. Silence had answered back. And it hadn't been kind. There was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when the world considered asking for permission again. It surfaced in draft memos that were never sent, in emergency sessions where the question hovered just long enough to be felt before being dismissed. The instinct was old and deeply human. If something had the authority to reshape reality, perhaps it could be reasoned with, appealed to, appeased. That instinct died quietly, because no one could agree on who would ask. Beerus had removed more than structures. He had removed the idea of appeal, the assumption that power existed somewhere above consequence but below accountability. This was not a force that could be lobbied, challenged, or framed as opposition. There was no court for this. The moment that truth settled, the world crossed the point of no appeal. Vought tried anyway. Not openly, not officially. A delegation assembled under the guise of a risk analysis summit, populated by people whose names were never meant to appear together on a document. Their plan was subtle: demonstrate restraint, competence, and humility without directly addressing Beerus at all. Signal worth without demanding recognition. It was a negotiation strategy designed for human gods. It failed before it began. The summit ended early when every system in the building lost access to comparative models. No projections, no simulations, no scenario trees. The data wasn't deleted. It simply stopped resolving into conclusions. Analysts stared at screens that offered no recommendation, no optimal path. Beerus had not appeared. He had not needed to. The message was unmistakable: there is nothing to discuss. Vought dissolved the delegation that same day. No announcement followed. The participants returned to roles that no longer carried influence. Their authority eroded not by scandal but by irrelevance. Homelander learned about it through omission. He was not invited, not consulted, not even mentioned. The realization hit harder than any confrontation ever could have. For the first time since his creation, decisions of existential importance were being made without considering how he might respond. He confronted a senior executive in a corridor that had once been cleared at his approach. "Why was I there?" he asked. The executive didn't flinch. He looked tired, Because this isn't about strength. Homelander's jaw tightened. Everything is about strength. The executive shook his head slowly. Not anymore. Homelander didn't kill him. He didn't threaten him. He walked away, and that restraint terrified everyone who noticed. The boys watched the power vacuum deepen. The enemy they defined their lives against was still alive, still dangerous, but no longer central. Systems they'd fought to expose were dismantling themselves without resistance. Huey struggled with the implications. So this is it. The bad guys just fade out. Butcher stared at a wall of declassified data scrolling in real time. No, this is worse. When villains don't fall, no one learns from it. Beerus sensed the tension ripple outward, not as noise, but as density. The universe had reached a state where correction could no longer be negotiated or delayed. Everything that remained was either essential or expendable. And Beerus was finished waiting. He didn't descend. He didn't announce, he focused. Across the planet, points of influence aligned themselves involuntarily, not physically, conceptually. Power centers that had survived through ambiguity suddenly found themselves exposed by clarity. Beerus selected one. Not the largest, not the loudest. The one that still believed appeal was possible. With a thought, he erased its authority. The building remained, the people inside remained, but the legitimacy that bound their decisions to consequence vanished. Orders were issued and ignored, commands logged and disregarded. Their power died without spectacle. On Earth, the effect was immediate and devastating. Markets froze, not from panic, but from uncertainty about whose rules still applied. Governments issued statements that no one waited to hear. Subs hesitated, unsure which hierarchy still mattered. Homelander felt it like a floor dropping beneath him. This wasn't defeat. This was exclusion. Beerus observed the aftermath with clinical interest. The universe had reached a configuration that could not be undone. The point of no appeal had passed, and with it, the illusion that survival depended on persuasion. This is what remains, he concluded. Not a verdict. A fact. The world would go on, not because it was forgiven, but because it had been simplified enough to function. Those who adapted would endure. Those who clung to relevance would disappear. Beerus turned away, his attention already drifting toward what came next. The universe trembled, not in fear but in resignation. Because once appeal is removed, only consequence remains. And consequence had just become permanent. After the point of no appeal, the world learned a new skill. Selection. Not the dramatic kind, not survival of the strong. This was quieter, administrative. Decisions were no longer debated, they were filtered. Anything that required justification beyond function began to fall away. Institutions discovered, often too late, that tradition was not a defense. Visibility was not protection. Legacy did not equal necessity. What survived was what worked without explanation. Hospitals that ran on redundant systems and local authority stabilized first. Logistics networks that had been stripped of branding and politics adapted faster than those clinging to centralized control. Communities that relied on clear chains of responsibility endured. Those that depended on image fractured. Vought existed in fragments now. The name still carried weight in old contracts, but the machinery behind it had been reduced to a skeleton crew of compliance officers and damage controllers. The internal culture, once driven by dominance and spectacle, had thinned into risk avoidance and silence. Decisions were made by omission. Initiatives died not by cancellation, but by never being proposed. Homelander remained, but only barely. He was still deployed, still powerful, still capable of catastrophic violence, but the world had reclassified him, not as a solution, not as a threat to be appeased, as an unnecessary escalation. His handlers spoke in careful terms. His appearances were limited. His authority became conditional. Each restriction was framed as optimization, each delay as strategy. The lie was consistent enough to be convincing, until it was. Homelander felt the judgment in what was no longer asked of him. No one sought his opinion on global events. No one positioned him as the final word. He was invited to respond, not decide, to execute, not define. It was a subtler cruelty than defeat. The boys saw what survived from the shadows. Butcher tracked the collapse of familiar enemies with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. He'd wanted justice. What he got was obsolescence. "There's no reckoning," he muttered, "just pruning." Nodded grimly. "That's how you know it's not human." Huey watched ordinary people adapt. Small businesses reopening without waiting for approval. Neighborhoods organizing security without capes. News outlets reporting verified facts without speculation. The world felt smaller, harsher, but strangely more honest. He understood then what Beerus had done. Judgment hadn't destroyed the world. It had removed excuses. Beerus observed the survivors with detached interest. Not individuals, systems, patterns of endurance. The universe had been compressed into something that could carry weight without bending. This was the outcome he'd been evaluating. Not redemption. Viability. He turned his attention briefly to Homelander, not as a threat, but as a test case. A symbol designed for a world that no longer existed. The godlike protector who relied on being needed. Homelander stood on a rooftop one night, staring at a city that no longer looked up when he passed overhead. He clenched his fists, feeling the familiar surge of power, still there, still absolute. And useless. He made a decision then, not a plan, an impulse, the last refuge of relevance. If the world wouldn't fear him, he would remind it why it once had. The act was fast, overwhelming, unmistakable. A show of force calibrated to dominate headlines and reset hierarchy. It failed instantly. Not because he was stopped, because no one responded the way he expected. Authorities didn't scramble, militaries didn't posture, media didn't amplify. The event was contained, documented, and contextualized within minutes. Damage was mitigated, responsibility reassigned, the narrative reframed. Homelander wasn't elevated. He was absorbed. The world treated his outburst like a malfunction, not a message. That was the moment Beerus acknowledged him. Not with anger, with finality. He didn't erase Homelander. He didn't weaken him. He didn't intervene directly. He did something worse. Beerus removed Homelander's centrality. A subtle adjustment to the structure of consequence itself. Homelander's actions would still cause damage, still cost lives, still matter locally. But they would never again define the world's trajectory. The universe reweighted itself around that decision. Homelander felt it immediately, a drop in resistance that wasn't relief, like punching air where a wall had been. His power had nowhere to land. He screamed into the night, unheard. Beerus looked away. This was what survived judgment. Systems that functioned without ego, authority without spectacle, power that didn't need to be seen to be real. The universe would endure like this, not peacefully, not safely, but sustainably. Beerus sensed the boundary forming, the last evaluation before departure. One final consideration remained, not whether this universe deserved to continue, but whether its continuation required him. The answer was almost clear. Almost. Beerus lingered at the threshold, the fabric of reality tightening around his presence one last time. If he left now, what remained would harden into permanence. If he stayed, something else would be lost. The universe waited, not in fear. In readiness. Beerus did not announce his departure. There was no final demonstration, no closing judgment, No cosmic punctuation to signal that the most decisive presence this universe had ever encountered was finished with it. One moment, reality carried the subtle pressure of his attention. The next, that pressure was gone. The absence was immediate and permanent. Systems didn't collapse when Beerus left. They locked in. The adjustments he had forced into existence hardened into rules. Pathways he had simplified refused to recomplicate. Authority structures that had lost legitimacy did not slowly recover. They failed to regrow at all. The universe did not relax. It stabilized. Across the world, indicators that had once spiked around Beerus' presence flatlined, not to normal but to a new baseline. Satellites resumed predictable orbits. Communication networks synchronized without delays. Emergency systems functioned without hesitation, not because they feared being noticed, but because hesitation was no longer incentivized. Fear had been replaced by clarity. Vought International made a final attempt to reassert itself weeks later, a rebranding, a restructuring, a public-facing narrative about responsible evolution. It collapsed within days, not from scandal, not from sabotage, but from disinterest. No one needed Vought anymore. Its remaining assets were absorbed by governments and local authorities with startling efficiency. Contracts were rewritten without protest. Subs were reassigned, regulated, or quietly retired. The machine that had once turned fear into profit was dismantled piece by piece, not by force, but by irrelevance. Homelander watched it happen in real time. He wasn't imprisoned, he wasn't executed, he wasn't exiled. He was contained by context. His movements were monitored, his appearances limited, his influence diluted until it resembled that of any other volatile asset. He could still kill, still destroy, still terrify individuals. But the world no longer oriented itself around him. The final blow wasn't Beerus' judgment. It was the world's indifference after Beerus left. Homelander tried one last time to matter. Not with violence, violence had already failed, but with words, a speech, a declaration, a demand for recognition broadcast through every channel he could still access. The response was swift and procedural. The broadcast was cut, not censored, reclassified. The message was archived, contextualized, and stripped of urgency. Analysts discussed it as a case study in unstable leadership. Commentators debated policy implications rather than moral panic. The public moved on within hours. Homelander stood alone in a studio designed for applause, listening to silence that no longer waited for him to fill it. The boys survived. Not triumphantly, not cleanly, but undeniably. Butcher never got the ending he wanted. No cathartic kill, no justice carved into flesh. The enemies he dedicated his life to didn't die screaming. They faded, reorganized, or were quietly neutralized by systems that no longer needed heroes or monsters. It left him angry, and strangely relieved. Huey adapted fastest. He saw what the world had become and understood it for what it was, smaller, colder, but honest. Power still existed, violence still happened, but lies no longer scaled well. Helped build something new, localized accountability, oversight that functioned because it didn't rely on spectacle. Frenchie and Kimiko disappeared into lives that didn't make headlines. For the first time, the world didn't feel like it was waiting for something to break. It felt like it had already been broken and reset into something harder. Somewhere beyond perception, Beerus paused. He did not look back at Earth out of sentiment. He didn't feel pride or regret. He assessed the universe one final time, the way a craftsman inspects a structure after removing faulty supports. It stood, not because it was good, because it was sufficient. Beerus had not saved this universe. He had not redeemed it. He had not taught it anything. He had removed the excess. That was all a god of destruction was ever meant to do. With no ceremony, Beerus turned away, his presence withdrawing completely from the fabric of reality. No marker remained. No tether persisted. The universe did not follow him with its gaze. It moved on. And that was the final consequence. Not destruction, not judgment, but a world forced to exist without gods, without symbols larger than systems, without fear as a currency. A world that would never again mistake power for importance. Beerus was gone. What remained would never forget the shape he left behind. And nothing, no hero, no monster, no god, would ever fill it again.